Okay, good.
Hello, everyone. My name is David Honorato. I am a fourth-year history major, and the title of my presentation is Why Did Russian Soldiers Join the Russian Revolution? I would like to thank my faculty mentor, Dr. George Mitchells, for guiding me throughout the completion of my research project. My research project, it focuses on the experiences and the emotions of the Russian soldiers on the Eastern Front during World War I. And it would be these soldiers that would later on, they would overthrow the Tsarist government in the February Revolution of 1917. And I was mostly interested in these soldiers' emotions and how these emotions they evolved over time. And so it is important to note that historians have, until recently, they have ignored the experiences and the emotions of the Russian soldiers, and they were definitely ignored by the Russian governments before and after the February Revolution. And unfortunately, in these wars, the experiences and the emotions of soldiers, as I said before, they are ignored, and they continue to be ignored today as well. And so the main question I asked when I was writing my research project was, why did Russian soldiers join the Russian Revolution? As I mentioned before, I wanted to understand why the Russian soldiers decided to participate in one of the most violent revolutions and in one of the biggest military mutinies in history. And the soldiers were arguably the most influential figures in the revolution. And it was their participation of the soldiers that allowed for the Russian Revolution to be a success. For example, when these soldiers began to point their weapons at the Tsarist government, the Tsar Nicholas II, he was left with no other choice but to forfeit his power. And so in order to better understand what convinced the soldiers to join the revolution, I asked the following questions. What did the soldiers think about the war? And how did the war experience shape the soldiers' perspective? And in order to understand the soldiers' perspective, I used primary and secondary sources. The primary sources, they were letters written by the soldiers to their friends or their family. And so in the letters written by the soldiers in the years before the outbreak of the February Revolution, one of the things that the soldiers wrote about was trauma. And so in a letter written by an unnamed soldier to his friend in Moscow in December of 1914, December 15 of 1914, the soldier writes, quote, "The struggle between enthusiasm and death is a struggle between two unequal forces. We've been brutalized here." In another letter written by an unnamed soldier in January of 1917, which was on the eve of the February Revolution, the soldier writes, quote, "Each minute the threat of death makes us burrow into the earth," end quote. Another thing that the soldiers would write about in their letters was regarding insufficient food. And so in the same letter that that I previously quoted on, the soldier, he writes, quote, "We are concerned about how we will be fed. One lentil at lunch and one at dinner. We have endured enough hunger and cold." And so as a result of both trauma and insufficient food, that would accumulate on a daily basis. These experiences, they help to explain why the soldiers would choose to overthrow the Tsar's government in the February Revolution of 1917. And so one of the things that the February Revolution accomplished was that it helped establish a revolutionary government, and one of the many things that this new revolutionary government did was that it initially catered to the wishes and the desires of the soldiers. One of the things that this revolutionary government did was it passed Order Number 1. It was passed by the Petrograd Soviet in the early days of March 1917. And what Order Number 1 did was that it limited the power of the officers. This meant that the officers, they could no longer inflict cruel and unusual punishments towards their soldiers. Order Number 1 also gave soldiers political rights. One of these political rights consisted of the soldiers having the right to elect their committees. And what these committees did was that they advocated for the soldiers' well-being. What these committees meant for the soldiers was that the soldiers could now have their voices heard, and they could now influence political decisions made by this new revolutionary government. And so now that the soldiers, they had acquired basic political rights, it raised their hopes and expectations for a better future. Another thing that the revolutionary government did was the abolition of the death penalty. And the death penalty was regarded by the soldiers as a cruel and unusual punishment. The death penalty, it was inflicted on the soldiers and as punishment, and some of these punishments that Russian military officers applied to soldiers was they punished soldiers for desertion from the army. They punished soldiers with the death penalty for refusing to fight. And they also punished soldiers for many countless and insignificant things that the officers deemed was justifiable to apply the death penalty. And so when the revolutionary government got rid of the death penalty, the soldiers celebrated, and it raised their hopes and expectations for a better future. And so by the summer of 1917, everything would once again change for the worst for the soldiers. It was in the summer of 1917 that the Allied powers had convinced Russia's Socialist Prime Minister, Alexander Kerensky, to launch a campaign against the German forces on the Eastern Front. And so what the Kerensky offensive did on June of 1917 was that it ordered Russian soldiers to launch a military offensive on the southern parts of what is now modern-day Ukraine. And in order for Kerensky to have his military offensive launched, he had Order Number 1 rescinded. And so what that meant was that soldiers were once again forced to obey the orders of their officers. And the soldiers' committees that the soldiers had once initially elected, they were now powerless. Another thing that Kerensky did to push for his military offensive was he had the death penalty reintroduced. And so this meant that the soldiers that deserted and the soldiers that refused to fight in this military offensive, it meant that they were now to be executed. And so the soldiers were now forced to fight against their will. The military offensive that Kerensky ordered, it was a disaster. And so a soldier named Guryanov, he realized how disastrous this offensive was. And so he wrote about it in his letter to the Central Executive Committee of Soviets on August 5, 1917. Guryanov writes, quote, "This offensive has become loathsome to all soldiers. This attack has led to nothing but ruin," end quote. Another thing that the Kerensky offensive did was, once again, the soldiers experienced insufficient food. And so an unnamed soldier writes a letter to the provisional government regarding this issue. And so he writes of how the soldiers received in the early days before the outbreak of the October Revolution. He writes how soldiers received, quote, 1 pound of bread and 1 ounce of meat, end quote. And so as a result of the failure of the offensive and the lack of food that the soldiers experienced, it was very similar to the experiences that they initially suffered, that they initially had gone through under the Tsar's government. And so it was even more reasons to begin to resent Kerensky's government. And so the failure of the military offensive, it resulted in the relationships between Kerensky's government and the relationships between the soldiers. It completely deteriorated. It was at this time that threats were now made to Kerensky, and it was reflected in a soldier's letter to the Central Executive Committee of Soviets. The soldier writes, quote, "The time to pay up will come though. You're no better yourselves, and here, when the cup of sorrow fills to the brim, then watch out, all of you. It'll be worse for you than for Nicholas, because the Tsar was an enemy and nothing good is expected from an enemy. But from you as friends, the people expected good." And so this military disaster, it was significant in leading to a radicalization process that would it would lead to a second revolution known as the October Revolution. And the soldiers that no longer supported Kerensky's government, they would help the Bolshevik party under Lenin into power. And so when I was doing this project, I realized how soldiers' perspectives are hard to find regarding war. One of the reasons was that soldiers, they were silenced by their officers. Their testimonies, they were hidden or destroyed. And it was during the time of the Tsar's government that their letters were inspected by police working at post offices, and so letters that were critical of the Tsar's government, they were censored and they weren't mailed to its intended destination. And it was the letters that survived that were later accessed by historians and archives. A lot of the traumas that the soldiers experiences, they are ignored. So for example, there are countless war veterans who suffer from mental disorders. They are physically handicapped, and these traumas and their miseries, they are hardly addressed by media outlets or by politicians in power. And in this magazine right here, the headline suggests that finding correct solutions is complicated, since there has been little to no previous successful attempts to solve the soldiers' traumas and their miseries. And so one of the things that the Russian Revolution did was that it demonstrated how the soldiers made their voices heard. It would be millions of soldiers that would rise up in rebellion in an attempt to survive the brutal conditions on the Eastern Front of World War I. And these soldiers that experienced these miseries on the war front, they would rise up in rebellion in a desperate attempt to survive and to preserve their humanity. Once again, I would like to thank Dr. George Mitchells for helping me create my research project.
Thank you, David. Thank you. I certainly have a number of responses, but I don't think I should start.
For Q&A, do I stop share and, do I stop recording?
Yeah, you can, I think you should stop. So Dr. Lutzowski, would you like to start, or maybe